Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hey, Greg. I owe you a message. How's it going? Good morning, everybody. GM. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so today we have a fun topic that is near and dear to my heart that I think will take hopefully a short amount of time to go through some preamble, and would love to get into discussion, conversation, and a more collaborative question and answer or conversational section. The topic is building Web3 communities, and maybe just to take a second here, we're now in week 6 of Kernel. Expo Week has been completed. We've gotten through a lot of the Learn track materials on the prehistory of what has happened in Web3, and we're kind of looking ahead to the types of games and communities that we could be building, and most specifically, how adventures in Kernel can think about the growth of their communities in healthy, sustainable ways for themselves and for the people within those spaces. And our intention with putting it here, I think Sachin had this idea, and it's been really good to think about it as a time where you can think about, okay, after Kernel, with the initial group of people that I want to continue working with, what can I do to inhabit and enrich those spaces and take them well beyond Kernel with at least some of the ideas that we could provide to a space like that. So that's what I'll try to do, with just reflections on what that might have looked like for us over the last 5 weeks, and from where they've come from for me. So the core thing that is worth telling about the Kernel story, at least as we talk about building Web3 communities, is the infrastructure upon which it is built. This is something that Andy has talked about as well, and it is worthwhile to note in the story of how Kernel was constructed that we had some models and some infrastructure that were built in advance of us bringing a single person into a space. The first model was Titans, which is a program that I was very lucky to be a part of when I was in university. It was kind of like a capstone course. You may have heard me speak about it before. It was run by a man named Britt Harris, who had been the CEO of Bridgewater, which is kind of like the world's largest hedge fund. He left Bridgewater to come back to Texas to run a $100 billion pension fund, and on the side decided he had some time to start this program called Titans, which would have been impressive in its own right, but what was more impressive was the ways that the people in the community seemed to move together. I applied to be a part of the 19th group of Titans, and it was just this kind of instinct that you got that, okay, there's a lot of programs like this at this university, but for whatever reason, there's something like about the way that the people that are going through Titans seem to talk about it, and you didn't really have a good sense of it until you spent a bit of time in the sphere. And so it started with the application process. You kind of had to get some referrals from people who were in Titans. You get a sense of some specific questions that they were asking. There were some interesting components there for me, but I still didn't really get it. Although those things helped. And one of the things in order to apply to Titans was you had to go to the last class of the previous batch. And so when you went to that last class, you saw kind of like a graduation of one of the Titans groups. And then you went to dinner with a lot of the people who were in that particular group, as well as had kind of like an interview style setting. And a lot of this might sound familiar because that's how we thought of the kernel group interview process, the hope being that it was much less about the interview and much more about just a conversational space, which is something that we learned. I think from my side, I learned a lot of that from Britt and how he welcomed us into that community. So that's all great. But one thing that I'll zoom into here is infrastructure at the next level. So when you got into Titans, the first thing that became very clear was that while this was a finance upper level course, you had this syllabus that seemed to have some finance stuff, but a lot of stuff that wasn't particularly finance oriented. So the evolution of finance, crossing over into discipline and relative value, global investing, alternative investments. But then there's questions on here like, why should you become successful? How do you make decisions? What are the attributes of success? Who is right to love was kind of like one of the ones that really expanded it, where there was a relationship talk where if you had a significant other, Britt and his wife led this at their home and had you and your significant other come into their home and have dinner and speak about relationship in that regard. And it, like, long story short, became very clear that the infrastructure that was set up in this community was set up in a particular way. And there was particular focus that was put on a integrated existence, not just a focus on finance. And for us, we took inspiration from that, but have, graciously, with Andy's work, taken it to a Web3 context, and have the flavor being, yes, a lot of Web3 topics in the course of kernel, but also these personal conversations and the ability to hopefully bring those together. So I share these things to speak of kind of like the infrastructure that is the pre-work that can really set things up well for the point at which anyone may be able to join the space meaningfully. And the stories here are, I guess, in two parts. One is the pre-work in terms of this literal infrastructure, and Andy would add, the kernel syllabus being on an open source website where anyone can make pull requests, where there's an easy guide to translations for people who would be interested in that type of thing. Anything that you can do to make your project more extendable, you've set yourself up infrastructurally with a strong foundation. I guess I'll pause there for a second to see if there's any questions. So maybe I'll look in the chat to see some GMs. GM to everybody. Cool. So then you move to perhaps like conversation around rituals. And I've put on here some of the ways that we hope and we're very grateful that people can extend upon a space that is truly a shared one as a means for describing kernel as a space. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm actually going to skip ahead to something that really grounds me in this discussion personally. It's this evolution of trust model. We come back to it again and again in kernel. For me personally, it was one of the most influential games that gives me a really clear indication of, okay, what does trust building truly look like? How can we embody it in our technologies, but also in a lived experiential sense in our communities? And this game, which I'm hoping maybe we can get into the chat in a second, I can do it, or maybe somebody else has the link. It comes to these three conclusions. One, it tries to ask one simple question, which is, would a trust would a world with trust be richer or poorer? And that's kind of like the initial premise of like, okay, like why are we even talking about this? And then there's this word evolution of trust. So it's not about forcing it upon somebody. There's this sense that it has to be grown, enriched, and cultivated. And then it talks about the three ways that's made possible. One is repeat interactions. The knowledge of possible future interactions is really important for the evolution of trust. You need to have a sense that these people will be around and in your life. The potential for win-win scenarios, finding and exploring increasingly positive sum games, and then low miscommunication. So how can you build a space that reduces miscommunication, and that even if miscommunication naturally occurs, there are ways to move past them, because it's just the requirement of any communal space. There will be miscommunication. We will have to move through them, and ideally the space allows for that. So with that being said, we can go back to kind of like more rituals and structures. So the next part of the community building in our case was, okay, well, we know we want everyone to introduce themselves, and for it to very quickly become a space that is shared amongst all of us, and where there's a sense of ability to kind of like maneuver as you please throughout this space, without any particular end goal in mind. That's something that we were really hopeful for with Kernel. And I feel grateful to everyone who has explored this with us and who's with us here today and has hosted a Junto or has attended a Junto, because that is an example of how this has come to be, right? Every week there are 10 to 12 different Juntos on topics that we could not have thought of or proposed ourselves, that lead to conversations in smaller spaces that reduce miscommunication and increase the ability for positive sum outcomes, because you're finding spaces that are truly, genuinely something that is a core focus for you. While we lean on this structure, right? We still have this structure. There's Tuesdays build tracks, Thursdays we're going through 2 modules. There's like a good balance that we try to strike, and that we could always use feedback on improving, between structure that we provide and then free-flowing movement. And in many ways, this we think can be a good model for any type of community, well beyond Kernel. Which brings me to kind of like 2 last points. We go back to the end of this trust game, and there are 2 key takeaways. It's called the biggest lesson in this game. Number 1, what the game is defines what the players do. So in your community, the question to ask is, what is the game that you are asking people to play? And how might that game increase the possibility or benefit from these 3 traits: repeat interactions, win-win scenarios, low miscommunication? And it poses a problem that ultimately I think is one of the biggest problems that Web3 is fighting against, which is that it's not that people are losing trust, it's that the environment is pushing us away from trust. It's pushing us away from these deeper connections and ways for interacting well. And this brings us to The Lost Garden, which has a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, which was 1974, so it's a long time ago, which says, "What should young people do with their lives today? Many things, obviously, but the most daring thing is to create stable communities in which the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured." This quote from Vonnegut is something that I think about a lot, and is the starting quote for this article called Pro-Social or Social Economics for Game Design. It's linked in module 5 of the kernel syllabus, which is the module on tokens. And the thought process here is that token economies ultimately are deriving a lot of their historical precedents from game design, and looking at game designers who aren't really thinking directly about tokens, but have been thinking about game economies for the last 25 years is perhaps one of the strongest groups of people that we can lean upon. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this article that also can be linked. Tactics, things to avoid, ways to design games that are non-toxic. But then they do put out these 5 potential characteristics of pro-social games. One is friendship, the formation of, and maintenance of healthy, meaningful friendships. I think that the second point is actually one that could be the first, which is thriving individuals, the facilitation of individuals' eudaimonic, happiness, individuals that feel competence, volition, relatedness for themselves and for others, altruism, positive group norms, and shared goals. Altruism, positive group norms, and shared goals. So these 5 characteristics seem to be things that we can build towards in designing interesting games, whether those games be token games, DeFi games, NFT games, or whatever the next Web3 game might look like. If we can build with these particular principles in mind, we have the basis for sustainable community. And sustainable community is what allows games to go on for the longest period of time. Which brings me to really the last point. This is something that Andy has been writing about and has been kind of like a topic of ongoing conversation in the last week. There's been a lot of conversations around ownership as we went through the token mechanisms. And as we get to the end of the build track, go on to build communities, it's very likely that you're considering Web3 components. But one of the questions that we've been asking is, what is ownership in this Web3 context? And how can we think about these shared communal spaces that everyone owns, and by distinction of everyone owns, perhaps no one really owns? And there's a quote that starts off some of our explorations of this from the Tao Te Ching, which says, "To bear and not to own, to act and not lay claim, to do the work and let it go, for just letting it go is what makes it stay." I think I'll probably leave it at that for now, knowing that I shouldn't try to describe things any better than Ursula Le Guin and Lao Tzu, our good friends. But the point here is that it's beyond tokens and beyond anything that is your own, let's say, motivation for starting and growing a project. Listening as a response to the people that are within the space and making room for that is where I think we have one of the greatest opportunities in Web3, which is that we do not have to go after hundreds of millions of people. We can build spaces that are more human readable and are for smaller, more connected groups. And I think that's my last piece on Web3. We have a lot of time left and I'd like to use it well. So happy to answer questions or hear comments from anyone as a starting point. And kind of decide where we want to go from there.
I could go.
Yeah, sure.
Nisreen, would you like to go? I actually have a kind of specific question, so please go ahead.
Well, Sure. Okay, sure. So, sorry if my background noise is a little loud, but so to ask this to Colonel, actually, I'm just curious to see how you'd frame it in words. But when you asked what is the game we are asking people to play, what is the game that you all are asking people to play with Colonel?
Really good question. It's a really good question. Um, there are two ways to answer it. One would be down the personal lesson component of the kernel syllabus, and then one would be down the Web3 lesson. And in some sense, they really intertwine. On the Web3 component, one thing that we think is happening in Web3 is there is a push towards the continued creation of free money. And I know Andy's on the call. Maybe if it's appropriate, we could spend a little bit of time on like what free money actually means. But that is the kind of like pulse of the Web3 lessons is going down this like rabbit hole of defining what free money really is, and how through our own designing of Web3 communities, we can make money more and more free. And so there's kind of like that game that is consistently being played, I think every kernel block and in Web3 is how can we design better games that truly allow for more interesting things to happen with larger swaths of people to join and be a part of the game. But then maybe the more important part is on the personal part, which is your unique journey, whatever that might be. Having a deep internal understanding of what it is that you want to explore in your own life, well beyond Web3, and the types of people that you want to surround yourselves with, and the community and internal state that has you the most excited about the present moment, and has a keen intuition and feel for the importance of that moment, this moment that we're all sharing now together. And it's maybe an opportunity to go to this idea, this signature economies idea that is still being worked through, but talks about both of these things. And actually, I'll pause there because I don't want to go too much into it, but maybe that's the starting point to the answer.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, that was helpful to just see how you frame it.
Exactly.
Divide up that game.
Follow up information. Yeah.
I love the background music, by the way. Seems like a party over there. Okay, cool. We have some questions in the chat. I'd be happy to keep going through some of these. I'm not sure if Andy or Sachin, if you have any things that you'd like to add. I'm happy to keep going, but Sabina has a good question on how kernel has evolved over the years, learned from its mistakes, how community growth was enabled. Happy to answer, but also could be good to hear from others. Sachin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you know your views are important here. And then another one on how gamification and trust come together. Can rewarding certain behavior really grow genuine trust? Another great question. Cool. Especially curious how you preserve knowledge community over time. Cool. I'll start there. From the start, one thing that was really important to us was just kernel Genesis block being an incredible group of people to start the process with. We had this structure in our minds. We knew what we kind of wanted to do with the 8 weeks. We had the general onboarding flow figured out with quite a comprehensive template of what we wanted the first 8 weeks of experience in kernel to look like for someone in Genesis block. And then we had a pretty good template of what we wanted being an alumni kernel to feel like, which is not that the 8 weeks was the end of your kernel experience, but that really from that point forward, you were a part of the community, and that being an alumni is really hopefully where a lot of the fun and value of being in kernel can come from. And the 8 weeks really is just an introduction to the ideas and the mode with which we are exploring. And so the evolution, I think in a lot of ways has been like operational. How can we take this structure that we knew worked well for the first group of 200 people to now there have been 1,000 people that have gone through kernel, and how do we think about the potential first 5,000 people? How do we think about increasingly the alumni network, actually, Sabina, to your point, because as we get to block 5, we'll have 1,000 people that are in the alumni network. We want to make sure that that group has increasing amounts of awareness and attention being put towards it, while we maintain the experience of the first 8 weeks of the block. So that is definitely a part of the process that we are at with kernel. And I would imagine that many communities get to as they get to kind of like a second level of scale. Andy or Sachin, anything that you would add there?
Yeah, I mean, wonderful turtleneck. Thank you for bringing the vibes. I think that in my way of answering Nazreen's question is shorter, which is to say that we're asking you to play, not any particular game, just to play, right? That's we engage infinitely, then everything becomes play, not in the sense of some sort of trivial notion of the word, but this deep reflection of the nature of reality in some sense. That's, there is this article, right, somewhere in the kernel syllabus from the BAF that's written also by David Grieber, and at the end he tells this wonderful story about two Chinese philosophies, a Chinese philosopher and his friend Zhuangzi and Huizi, who are arguing about whether fish can feel happy or not. And it's a really wonderful argument that they have, and Zhuangzi, who's the one telling it, shows Huizi is winning. But when we move away from that particular mode of interpretation, winning, losing, right, wrong, good, bad, noble community, materialistic community, all of this dualistic way of thinking, then we see that even these two rather funny Chinese figures standing on a bridge arguing about whether fish can be happy or not are themselves engaging in a form of play. That we can understand the happiness of fishes or ants or inchworms, because what drives us to think and argue about such matters is ultimately exactly the same thing. It's the strive for like fun. Even electrons play at the deeper atomic levels of reality. So I love that way of thinking about it, because it also points to the sorts of like rituals and narratives that are actually interesting in Web3 and the wider world are those that have to do with some kind of play, some kind of fun enacted together in the world, right? It's not, people take the peer-to-peer parts, which is so powerful and potent in all of these stories, and they apply it directly in this too self-recursive way where they say, we're now going to build community. And that's not what we set out to do at kernel. We set out at kernel to build a learning environment, and community has been the emergent result of that, one of the emergent results. If you set out to build a community, inevitably in that impulse and in that intention comes along the seed of toxic behavior, right? If you aim for belonging, you're ultimately going to exclude as well. It's just inherent in the very structure of what you're doing. The reason that play, and in particular infinite play, is such a powerful way of being in the world is because it doesn't include or exclude. It just doesn't operate in that particular framework. And so in some way, like the deepest ritual of these kinds of things is to see the world in a non-dualistic way. I'm not separate from the fish. I'm not separate from the inchworms. I'm not separate from the ants. I'm not separate from Vivek's wonderfully radiant white turtleneck. All of these things are of a piece with the whole. And there is, in that realization, both deep lived responsibility and total liberation. Because I can play. I can play and play and play and play. And when I am free, my money is free, my work is free, my being in this world is free.
Andy, you know, leaves his video off, so I can't make fun of whatever it is he's wearing, which is not so fun. But I'm, yeah, I'm gonna
playing with power dynamics. You know, that's all. I'm having a lot of fun.
I see what you're doing there. Yes, and I think that, you know, there's a lot of skepticism around community, which I think comes through in Vienna's question, which is fair skepticism for the reason that Andy is describing. Vienna's question says, feels like a lot of people are building building communities and competing to be the world computer type of a way. How might world computing fabric be built? I'm not sure, Vienna, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I just, see, like, I wonder, I know that there are groups also looking into this, like, how do you build like shared cultural computation? I was in a discussion with friends around like, how like everyone now is a part of a lot of DAOs and stuff. And so like how would the interweaving be done, the fabric of all this communities, and how can we even speak the same language? I like think about, my times organizing movement in Malaysia, where we had to find a way to bring the Islamic group all the way to the indigenous people together. And I wonder, who are groups that are trying to do that? How are they doing that? And then heck, is there a technical language for that? Things like that.
It's a really good question. Yeah, I think that people are already starting to feel that in terms of like the realities of the DAO movement today, is that like it can feel fun, but in some sense, it can feel scattered. It can feel like there's lots of different options. It can feel like it's overwhelming. It's more focused on finance than prior versions of organization as currently constructed. So what's going on? Like, why is that happening? And how do we move past that? I think it's a really good open question that we definitely are exploring as well.
And I don't know if this fits into infinite game, but I definitely thought like, hey, maybe temperature could be a way that people can conceive this collective identity together, and that they're in a gameplay together, and it's also like recursive in a way that is also inherently rewarding for them. So I don't know if anyone, open to any kind of thoughts around this.
Yeah, I have a couple things, and I hope this is a helpful way to go through this. There's like a couple things that are going through my mind. One is one of the more fun juntas that has come out of this block. We've been doing the Tokenomics study group with Michael Keating and lots of others. This last one yesterday was with Renee. and Naran Babalola from Penvala. And we had a Figma board up. It was kind of like a whiteboard that we tried to use as a part of the discussion. Naran came, we had some pre-work in there. We had some questions in there that we're improving upon. Michael's been doing great work, kind of like making that structure great, so that in the hour, it's literally kind of like everyone's at the whiteboard exploring and playing and trying to understand this token game together. And ideal state is that there's just like a lot of back and forth and conversation, and it's kind of like a game together to try to understand. And I think that this is the energy that seems to be like best case scenario for lots of Junto style environments. And it reminds me of this infinite game concept. If you haven't heard of it before, it's pretty deeply embedded in Web3 from a book called Finite and Infinite Games by a man named Ronald Coase. A lot of the early internet inspirations of Web3, including a man named Stuart Brand, cite this book as one of their favorites. And it seems like it's been a big part of the fabric of Web3's thinking at a very deep level. It's referenced in the Gaming Guild by Paul Gotti, who's done an incredible job putting it together. At the beginning here is kind of like a Slack thread after we played Among Us at one of the Juntos, where trust was broken by some liars who were the imposters and won the game a couple of times. But we took the chance to just kind of like explore like what is an infinite game and what does it look like. And this is the definition in the book. It says there are at least two kinds of games. One could be called finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play. For the purpose of continuing the play. And that means that the way that you win, quote unquote, in a infinite game is not by finding the limit and just kind of like being there. It's by expanding how the game is played. And so it's described, the rules of an infinite game are like the grammar of a living language, where those of a finite game are like the rules of debate. In the former, we observe rules as a way of continuing discourse. In the latter, we observe rules as a way of bringing the speech of another person to an end. And so continuing the play, being able to just enjoy our time together. That's in some sense a part of the infinite game. Any other questions or thoughts, conversation points?
I'm interested in this. It's not necessarily attention, but I think it's just maybe two different ideas that I hold in my head at different times in different contexts when we're talking about Web3 communities. Some of them, which you alluded to earlier, Vivek, are the idea that Web3 gives us the opportunity to create sort of more intimate, more human spaces with a number of people that is apprehendable and relatable and personal and maybe you could even say natural to us as animals, and that those we can create games and we can create incentives and we can create spaces for communities at roughly that scale, whether you're talking about 5 people or maybe 500 people or something in that ballpark. And at the same time, we're creating, as Vienna we're talking about earlier, a global computer. And so when we talk about this global scale, and in to the degree that we're talking about software and we're talking about finance and capital, there has been for some years a I think there may be two of these things have been happening. There's been a sort of you might call a long tail of all kinds of communities and creators and brands and identities and people and the ability to interact, you know, in very, very specific and kind of focused ways, you know, relevant, you know, perhaps just to one or a handful or a relatively small group of people. But there's also another end of the spectrum where you have you know, pieces of software and organizations, whether they be corporations or something else, that treat, you know, literally the billions of people on a daily basis, which is new. You know, we never had that until, you know, 10 years ago or something at the most recent. So I guess when we think about community in Web3, I don't think these are competing ideas. They're just maybe what I'm trying to say is, I think maybe we need maybe not, I was going to say taxonomy. I don't want to sound too technical, but I think maybe when we're talking about community, it might help to say, like, right now I'm talking about like a human scale community. I'm talking about a you know, whatever we want to call that size, that maybe isn't that different from the size of communities that humans have been used to, you know, living in and relating to for millennia. And then, but now what I'm talking about is this new scale of, whether you call it community or social network or whatever that is global, and or something in between. And because I think it's these things are both very relevant to Web3, and they share a lot of the same qualities, particularly to the degree that, you know, we might be using, you know, distributed ledgers or other kinds of new types of software to facilitate either of the two. But I wonder if our discourse maybe about communities needs to include a qualifier where you say, so I have some thoughts on this, but my thoughts are particular to these sort of human scale communities that are now possible in Web3. So I have this idea that I want to share with you. I have a question, but it's really more about global computers or social networks that span the world, or whatever that is. And it's just kind of a meta point that sometimes I think that some things apply to both. You know, some software applies to both, some principles apply to both, some philosophies apply to both, but I think, you know, to the degree, I mean, I think to the degree that kernel fellows are considering making things in the world, you know, where, you know, having some sort of explicit intentionality around, are you contemplating something that's more sort of human in scale, for lack of a better term, or are you contemplating something that's sort of global in scale, and what assumptions are you making that are relevant to each of those topics? It's not exactly a point or a question. It's just something that I'm wrestling with.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that it's like a tension to understand and work through. Tim, I think you have some thoughts.
Yeah, and apologies for, I mean, I just dropped in a couple more minutes before, Michael, what you said, but one of the things that I've experienced along the way, also just working with global communities and local communities, is that I feel like we kind of, it's like what is it? I think it might be an urban legend, but it's like, what is it like? Eskimos have like a bunch of words for snow, right? And it's kind of this idea that, like, in a language, like your ability to understand something like is defined by how many words you have or how descriptive you can be. And like in English, we have like this one word for community, but really what it is it's a catch-all, and it's representing all these different kinds of groups in all these different kinds of contexts. A place where it's really relevant, I'm not sure if DJ's on the call, but as we talk about Oak, when we're kind of in the local community and talking to people who have just been, you know, regular working class families in an area, it's like when people say the community, they mean, you know, kind of these legacy people and institutions that have been here for generations, right? And when we come on a web perspective and we say community, we mean it's like our user base or our audience, or people who contribute to an open source project, or people who create user-generated content around a meme. And it's a complete disconnect from like people on the ground. And I think that's very similar, Michael, to what you're getting to. And I think it does call for, I don't have the taxonomy, but it's been a note for mine for recently, but also even professionally, as I've been a part of a community, an online community that's grown from a couple hundred people to probably millions of people. And it's fractaled and splintered out into these subgroups of interest and geography and skill and affinity, or intersectional affinities, or other things. We still only have this one word. So if anyone knows of a good taxonomy on this stuff, I could probably search for it, but if anyone has that offhand, I really do think it's worth being a lot more descriptive about the networks and the groups that that we're building for and working with.
Really helpful, Tim. Amazing. Leave it open to other thoughts if anyone has any.
Hey, I have a question.
Please.
So first off, fit up the quarter zip free there, the white. It seems like there's sort of like these competing ideas. It's like we want to like define the game so players like will play, but we also don't want to like we also want to encode boundaries to let people play. So I guess like how do you guys sort of reconcile those two ideas where like you don't want to like define what people do, but you also kind of want to like leave it open for people to explore?
I think that in infinite games, Vince, the boundaries, infinite players play with boundaries, finite players play within boundaries. So the way that one thinks about it is like having it's like humility and intention is so important, right? That like when we create these kinds of boundaries, what is the nature of the boundary? It's inherently arbitrary. And the game is about like playing with that boundary, finding ways to make it permeable, finding different means of inclusion or exclusion based on context, these kinds of things. So just like some of the rituals in kernel revolve around gratitude, humility, devotion, and service, all of which are these self-recursive ritual-like customs that allow for us at once to say positively what our values are, but have the description and statement of those values be a means of interfacing with others who have different values. Right? So it's like one of the structures of like an infinite game, right? It's the reason why one thinks self-recursively about, like, for instance, value structures, which ones allow us the greatest degrees of freedom in terms of the kinds of games into which we can enter. And that does allow for, like, it's possible, I suppose, like Tim and Michael, that if you look at like the rationalist community online, or particularly around blogs like Less Wrong, or the old Slate Star Codex, these kinds of people, they always attach an epistemic status to their particular blog posts, which is an interesting feature of that community. And it would be interesting, I suppose, to have like a similarly attached statement of scale, perhaps in terms of like the particular level of the game that one is looking at, whether it's global computing or local community. But like one thing to note in this particular regard, right, like as is always the case with me, is that the word community comes from communitas or commonus, right, which means public spirit. And that's kind of an interesting feature. That's this word spirit itself, like, has, if you look into like the Sanskrit or the Greek pneuma, the Sanskrit prana, the Hebrew or the Aramaic ruch or ruch, like it's always the sound of the breath, and the spirit is always breath in all of these old languages. And that's because for any number of reasons, but primarily like the breath is that which we can do consciously, and yet which occurs without any kind of intervention on our behalf. It's at once a deeply individualized, embodied, and personal phenomena, and yet it is also that thing which we share with everybody else. It is quite literally the common ground which binds all of us. We all breathe the same air, rich or poor. This is what the Holy Spirit really is. It's just the air around us, nothing mystical necessarily. And the miracle is that you can move it in and out of your being and thereby continue living. And you know, it's again like I tell that story not as a dogmatic description of what this thing is. It's just indicative of how it's wonderful to have a taxonomy. It's wonderful to have clear compartmentalized categories or buckets into which things can be neatly put in order to generate the kinds of descriptions which are coherent and consequential. But similarly speaking, the deeper insight, I think, Tim, it comes through in how you speak, right? It's like this self-similarity across scale. Like if the principles which bind us together in each of these different kinds or scales of community are like similar, right? Self-similar, then there's like these interesting games which can be played in all sorts of different scales of communities, which rely on not dogmatic impositions or coercions of what kinds of games should be played, but these self-aware and self-referential playing with boundaries. That's something that kind of really interests me, right? Is that like we can't deny the need for boundaries, the need for some kind of coherence, but when we are very, very clear about the arbitrary and playful nature of those boundaries, then all of a sudden really, really interesting things can happen, whether one's talking about like the people who happen to be around you by accident of birth and geographic location, or the like-minded, like-hearted souls that you find online who are kind of for a moment dropping into your Zoom chats to share a few thoughts and then continuing along their wonderful day.
We hope everyone has a wonderful one. Yeah, I know we're like 5 minutes left. I want to say one quick thing, and we have Sid Code here with his hand raised. Sylvia's point, I really like agree with here, and I think it speaks to what Andy is describing, this way that we can define community and define our realities through our instincts on what best serves our own spirit. And Michael, this is maybe getting back to like where you started here. The spirit is the only part that exists both very much individually, but also collectively, right? Like the way that we are moving collectively through the world also, it's very deeply intertwined with my own individual lived experience. If I am not in tune and not enjoying my own existence, it's very hard to get a sense of what's going on around me with like clear eyes. So there's something about that, and it reminds me of a part of the trust game where, you know, in the game you see the effects of interpersonal trust at communal, like human readable 5 to 10 people level, if you can at the micro level handle for that, it is something that then becomes a part of the broader environment. I don't have as much time to like try to describe it well, and I want to play the game again, but there's definitely a part of that game where there are some surprises on how much it matters, like the types of individuals and the ways that the energy of the individual ripples through creating that more global environment. And that's the thing that I think is being encouraged in this context is perhaps just like more focus on that smaller group. And if we do that, then the ripples come. The opposite is not true though. If you start global, but do not stay focused on that individual spirit, the chance for public spirit to improve is very small or none, really.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Cosmic resonances. Yeah, we should have Kelsey here to talk about that. We may at the Fireset this week as we talk about principled games. I'm open to if there's anyone else who has anything as we wind towards the hour.
No, I'll ask my question some other time because we're almost done. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And Sylvia, is there anything maybe from this last point you'd like to share?
Oh no, just quoting random people on Zoom.
That's my favorite. I love the Durants. They're great. The lessons of history. Go ahead, Aaron, please.
I dropped the quote into the chat. The movement must go beyond its leaders. It's what folks used to say in like the 60s. So I linked, there's a lot of different activists who have said it. And I think it means being like egoless, sorry, and more collectivist, right? So if you start like, say, like a college club, does it continue after you? It's not about you, it's about the mission. And so that's kind of like what I took away from just what a lot of what we discussed today, that connectedness to others.
Totally. 100%. I don't think there's a better note to end on. That connectedness is really, I think, the hallmark of real community. Okay. Thank you for sticking around till the end. We hope you have a really, really great day wherever you are physically. Enjoy it. Have a great one. We'll see you soon.